Thanks very much, David. All right, so I'll just say quickly a couple of things, although I can't reply to all of those comments, but that's very helpful. And you're right that I'm not arguing for an absolute right of defense. I'm not nuts. Was that a skeptical laugh? Yeah, so you say that David's not talking about, in the ethnic minority case, you say that David's not talking about intended harms, and that it matters that what we're talking about is that he foresees that the other state's going to inflict these harms. But he can't have that because of his argument about the duty of care, which holds that the fact that you foresee that the harms will result from the intervening agency of the aggressor state is discounted, or he says even outweighed, by the fact that you owe a duty of care to your citizens. So he can't get around the problem in that way. So I think, but I agree with you, I think I'm skeptical about the notion of this duty of care that's held so widely across all coast citizens. I don't think I have a particularly stronger duty of care. I don't think that if I'm driving abroad I can be a bit more reckless because the people I might endanger are foreign. I think that my sort of general duties of care are spread pretty equally across people, and then I think I'm not really sure what kind of extra duty it is that we're talking about then once it's sort of something I owe to people in general, how that's distinct from just being an ordinary requirement to act morally. So I think the duty of care thing has to go, but I don't know whether David wants to let it go or not. The rape case is not meant to be analogous to war. It's just to show, it's just meant to explore whether and how much harms that you foresee count in proportionality. So it's not supposed to be an analogy about war. It's just to explore this idea of how much the foreseen predicted harms count. Because if it's true for a reductivist, if it's true in cases about individual self-defense, then it's going to be true in war as well. But it's not meant to be that the rape is like the war. That's not the sort of the idea. And just quickly, yeah, I mean, I think actually on a reductivist individualist view, the number of wars you can fight will be less than on a traditional view of war. I mean, it will be restrictive in that respect, is something that Jeff's argued as well. But we want to know, I mean, and this will be in many cases because they're disproportionate, but we want to know why they're disproportionate. So even though David and I might my view probably would not be as restrictive as David's, but still it's probably going to be more restrictive than than other people's views. But it matters why it's disproportionate. Even if we agree that in some cases that it is, we want to know exactly what it is that's made it so. Okay, but I won't say anything more about, because lots of people had their hands up. All right, let me go for a list. Okay. BJ, I have you. I'm trying to follow Seth's thing of people I don't know. Okay, all right. I think I have everybody, and I've gone for the lady I'm calling the lady in black.
Hi, I'm Casey Forker. I'm actually a current senior at University of San Diego. And I had just a few comments. I hope they can turn into questions and that you can comment back. With the idea of with the differentiation of vital rights and lesser rights, I kind of see a connection that I don't know if you want to continue with making, but with the example of the chocolate bar, if that lesser right of owning that chocolate bar is threatened, however, if that lesser right is connected in some way to a vital right, let's say for instance she's diabetic, and if she doesn't eat it, she's going to go into shock and possibly die, there a third party then has an obligation to help her resist, and Helen then has an obligation to resist and not submit, even though in proportional hit, like I forget who it was, but Jeff attacking her to take the chocolate bar, it's almost that it seems the connection between her lesser right and her vital right obligates everyone to resist it. And another point I had, you can kind of connect that with the idea of the voting right. A lesser right would be a right to vote. However, if Group X is losing their right to vote as a lesser right, and that would be connected to a vital right, that if they lose the majority in that nation, then their vital rights are going to be threatened. They might be kicked out of the country, they might lose certain rights, they might even be killed. So I think if there's a connection from a lesser right to a vital right, there absolutely is an obligation to resist, rather than an obligation to submit, even though the initial threat is to the lesser right. So I just want to know if you had any comment on that at all.
I mean, I think what I want to say is that those are cases where there's a direct threat to a vital interest. So if I nick your insulin, I haven't just stolen some property that you need, right? I've actually threatened your life by nicking your insulin. I think so the difference is that what we're talking about is conditional aggression, where your vital interests aren't harmed unless you resist, whereas the cases you're giving, your vital interests are harmed if you don't resist. Yes. So that's not a case of a conditional threat to a vital interest. That's a case in which if you do nothing, then your vital interest is threatened because you don't get, you go into a diabetic coma, and that's bad. So I think those are not, I see what you mean with disconnection, but I think actually I just want to say that's just a threat to a direct interest. And you could lethally defend against, and I don't know about whether I'd have an obligation. I'm not sure. I think we have obligations of self-defense, but I think I'd have a permission, and quite possibly the third party might have an obligation of other defense. Yeah, thanks. I've got to chair myself. Who's next? BJ.
So I agree with you, but I don't think you can make a stronger case than you do. Hold on. Oh, sorry. I agree with you, but I think you can make a stronger case than you do. I think you can defend against the objection. So I agree that you can resist against conditional aggression for other reasons than David gives. One of the things you consider is, what if the conditional aggression is nice? Right? What if it's nice? And the reason you reject that is because you say, well, this isn't plausible because they would make violence a condition. I don't think you have to respond to it that way. I think you can respond to it by a certain reliance on the value of autonomy, given that David agrees that we can resist to conditional aggression for causes, for example, of slavery. And here's how you would do that. If we imagine the classic mugger case, right, the highwayman case, if someone's going to rob $1 from you, we think, well, it's wrong to resist that. If we think it's going to escalate, just give them the buck. You can give an inverse of that. How about a benevolent mugger case, where imagine a mugger is trying to give you $1, okay, and they're going to kill you if you don't take it. Now, of course, the intuitions are even stronger. You really should just take the $1. Who cares what? Even if it is an infringement, right? Even if it's an infringement on your autonomy, maybe you say, I'm the kind of person I just hate taking money or whatever. So even if it is an infringement, then our intuitions are stronger, right? So you might think this backed up David's point. But actually, I think that's the wrong analogy. What we can do is give a strengthened benevolent mugger case, where instead of giving you $1, let's imagine that the mugger is saying, hey, I am going to direct your life. I'm going to take over your life and direct your life. And imagine that they would be much better at it than you are. Your life will go better if you submit to this mugger making all your decisions and your life plans and being the author of your life. They're going to take over. Your life will absolutely go better, and somehow you know that. I still think there you have a right to resist, simply based on the idea that I think is intuitively plausible that autonomy can be valued in such a way that you have the right to be the one who makes these calls. And if that's true at the individual case, then I think I can give an individual reductivist response that can work up to a collective project that can be valued to the person's autonomy in such a way that even national defense can be justified against even benevolent conditional aggression if they value the collective project, say, of self-governance as important enough for their autonomy. So this is using your rejection of the distinction between vital and lesser interests. I'm saying certain lesser interests to some people could be relationally valued to an individual, such that for their autonomy, that engagement in that collective project is like the strengthened benevolent mugger. And I hope the intuitions in strengthened benevolent mugger are such that you would think you could resist.
Thanks. So in a paper, which is sort of a cousin of this paper, I explore this idea of autonomy and whether, if I come and take over your house and I make you live what I call the trolleyology regime, where you have to spend all day like doing trolley problems with a toy train set, and I make you sing a special song and stuff, and read Francis Cam's work all day. But things are better for you, right? And it's hard to imagine, but things must have been pretty bleak before. So I agree with you, yes. I think that, because again, I think even if you thought that one person, I mean, actually, I used to wonder whether I could kill you to get you out the house. I hadn't really taken a firm view on that, but I thought it doesn't matter, because if it's not just me, but it's also my kids, then I can kill to get you out the house. And in war, there's going to be numbers, and numbers will matter. And at some point, it becomes proportionate. If we reject this distinction between these lesser and vital interests, or if we're not sure which one autonomy belongs to, then it becomes proportionate to kill you. And I think, and I'm not quite sure. So I agree with you. It's a kind of short answer, but a slightly longer answer is that I'm not quite sure how. I think there's a lot to think about in this respect, because there's all these different kinds of things I could do to you. And Victor and I had an argument about. So we're imagining that the happy mugger is threatening harm to you. And then when the question is, what if he's threatening harm to others? So Victor and I had a conversation about whether, I can't remember what, say I've got a woman locked in the boot of my car or something, and I'm going to kill her, unless Victor does exactly what I say, forever. And I seem to remember Victor saying, well, yeah, then I've got to do what you say, forever, because otherwise you're going to kill this woman. And I think we disagree about that, but I can see that it's an interesting disagreement. It's not clear to me, because there's all these what if I ban you from talking, right? I mean, forever. That's pretty awful, right? That's awful. But could you kill to stop? I don't know. I mean, Seth has raised these kind of questions as well about, autonomy is all very well, but can I kill you for it? I think the answer is probably yes, but that's kind of a different paper. Slavery could be more than just that, though. I mean, I do think it's a form of enslavement, and David has a case about this as well, which I talk about elsewhere. But I mean, I agree with you. Sorry, it's the short answer. I'll try and be quicker. Guy over here.
My name is Matthias Iser from Frankfurt University. I kind of pick up on BJ. The title is on conditional threats, but there's a certain, at least to my ambiguity, there's sometimes, in order to deal with these bloodless invasions and lesser evil, and that one says, well, with a conditional threat, the lesser interest that is endangered is actually not what is at stake here, but the conditional threat to take your life. So Christopher Finlay, for example, also talking about revolutions, he would say, well, if you protest against a dictatorial regime or let's say an oppressive regime, and then they use violence, then you can defend yourself. But I think this runs into a problem as soon as you have an extremely powerful oppressive regime that just lets you protest, but nothing changes. You fight for your rights, and you want to have certain rights of participation, of free movement, free, and so on. You have all these lesser interests, and the government just lets you protest, but they just still refuse your rights. And now I thought, in your scenario, if the government wasn't quite clear, is it that the government then reacts forcefully, and therefore it actually adds something to it, so it's kind of you're tortured in the dungeons of the secret agency, or is it that you would say, and I thought you also said that on that scale, it actually is not only lesser interests anymore. If your life and your political life is so diminished, then this is something you should call a vital interest, but then it wouldn't be a conditional threat anymore. This government poses a direct threat, and if that's the only route that you can take, then you might, and it's the last resort, you might actually use violence. So that's just my question of, and I think it makes sense to also distinguish between narrow and wide proportionality, because sure, just concentrating on narrow proportionality, I would ask, is it permissible to kill people in that government? Because that is actually the same analogy with the guy who tries to prevent you from going to vote.
So, thank you. So in the London case, the idea is, so I was imagining. So what David said is that you can't think about whether it's proportionate or not to resist unless you take into account what you predict the aggressor is going to do in response. And so in the London case, I was imagining that you protest or whatever you do, whatever they've told you can't do, right? They say if you protest, then we'll just start shooting you. We're nice to you as long as you go along with us, but if you protest or if you whatever, if you try to forcefully resist or even non-violently resist, then we're going to start shooting you, and then there's going to be a war. That's the kind of case I had in mind. But I mean, I'm not sure that it's a direct threat to the quality of life that arises from the conditional threat to your life, literally. So I'm not sure I want to say that then it's just a direct threat. Did you say a direct threat to my vital interests in that case? Or, I mean, I'm not quite sure what your case is. Sorry.
Well, I don't want to take too much time. Perhaps if you can protest, but really the government takes away your rights, and there's no, and they are so powerful in a certain.
I mean, really, that's not then much of a form of resistance, is it? Because you know it's going to be completely. It's not a way that can affect change.
No, I mean that let's imagine you could. The only way to get rid of that government is to use violence. So they are powerful enough to take into. They can accept your non-violent protests, but the only way to get rid of the government is to actually use violence. And now, but the question is whether you can use violence, because so far in the description it has only been lesser interest, and therefore you are not supposed to kill anybody, even those who oppress you. And that was my question, whether you would say, well, you could only kill them in the case that they attack you when you protest on the streets, or whether you would say no.
Sorry, my argument is that you can use lethal defense in this case when they threaten your political goods, was the idea. All right, thank you. Adil.
Really interesting paper. I was wondering first if it makes sense to break down the groups that could potentially be affected and ask sort of, what are we trying to justify? Are we trying to justify occasioning the death of Basque civilians, of Basque combatants? Are we trying to justify killing French soldiers or French civilians? Because it seems to me that each of these justifying the deaths of each of these groups would probably take different forms. Some might be based on consent, some might be based on standing to benefit, some might be based on an extended idea of liability. So in your examples, it seemed like what you were most concerned about were the deaths of Basque civilians. I'm not sure if that's right.
It's civilians and
general.
defenders, so I take combatants.
Right, so which is surprising to me, because I would have thought the toughest deaths to justify would be the deaths of French civilians, not Basque civilians, because Basque civilians may consent to being defended in this way, and they may stand to benefit from being defended in that way. So I would have thought French civilians are actually the really problematic group. So anyway, so in kind of thinking about this further, you may want to think about breaking down these different groups of potentially affected individuals and asking, well, what's the best justification? What's the hardest group to justify harming? Also, I think that I worry a little bit about the way you try to deal. So the case you give with the Londoners, it's very evocative, but so imagine if the French said to the Basque, look, once we conquer your region, we're going to give you full democratic rights, and you can completely participate in our polity on an equal footing. Would the people of that region still be entitled to resist? They wouldn't be subject to dictatorship, but their ability to sort of direct their own fate would be undermined in a particular way. And then the last thing is you may want to think about what the relationship is between these sort of conditional aggressions or political aggressions and just the kind of revolution and secession cases that Matthias sort of indicate, because they have they implicate the difference between vital and lesser interests, but there's no sort of conditional threat, at least explicitly involved. It might be worth asking whether that makes a difference, or whether all these cases are sort of a piece. Political aggression, revolution, secession, whether they really raise the same issues or whether there are different issues involved.
Thanks. Yeah, so on the last point, yeah, I mean, I think there is things to think about here about succession and things like that, which I haven't yet. The case where French say, look, you're going to get full democratic rights, but that's got to be, backed up by so long as you let us invade. And if you don't, then we're going to kill you.
Yeah, so but I'm just saying like, that you shouldn't rely too much on you shouldn't rely too much on the Londoner example, because there can be many other examples in which that form of political domination will look quite different. There might still be a background threat of violence.
I'm sorry, say that? Yeah, I'm not sure I want to go there right now. But I'm not sure. For me, it sounds like maybe what you're asking is there a requirement on the people to let it get to that stage?
No.
If they know that they're going to be offered these democratic rights in the future, does that have an effect on whether or not they're allowed to resist? Is that the idea?
It might be the idea. It was just that what the political aggression looks like is going to differ across cases, and so I just hate for you to kind of hang your argument just on the Londoner case, which seems, one among many. So I'd just like to see you kind of broaden it out a little bit, so it's not such an extreme case.
Okay, thanks. And the thing about dividing up people into these different categories, I'm not sure how much I want to do that because I don't put much stock in the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. So, and also, I mean, yeah, you're right that it could be that if everybody supports the resistance, something to be endangered, but also that you're always going to have people who can't example, and I also think that we might think that the people on where are we now, on the French side, that the civilians, many of them will bear at least some degree of responsibility for this invasion, right? So I'm not sure that really it would make a lot of difference. I'd probably treat them all as innocent, to be honest, the combatants on both sides and the non-combatants on both sides and the defending combatants, because I take them to be innocent as well. Because I do. All right, thanks. Victor.
Thanks very much for the paper. So I agree with a lot of what you say, and I agree with the chocolate example. And I only wish I could look as good as I look in your pictures, but that's a struggle for me now. So I wanted to think about intervening agency. So it seems like lots of people endorse a principle which says something like, if intervening agents wrongfully do the killings, then those killings are discounted in a proportionality assessment. I don't think that's the right principle. I think a more tailored principle is needed here. I offered this example to Saba, who defended something like this at the SAP. You were on the panel there, but I know from the photographs that you weren't fully awake. so let me remind you.
I may have missed it, yeah.
So here's the example. Imagine that a nuclear bomb is going to go off, which will kill everyone in the problem if nothing is done. And I can disarm the bomb, and I have to take one of two roads to do it. If I take the left-hand road, then I'll knock a boulder off, which will crush an individual. If I take the right-hand road, I'll dislodge a boulder, and then an evil person will throw the boulder onto an individual who otherwise wouldn't be able to kill this individual. If you think that we discount for the intervening agency, I ought to take the right-hand road. But that doesn't seem like the intuitive verdict. In fact, either I think I should flip a coin in this case, or perhaps I should take the left-hand road on the grounds that the individual on the right-hand road has a special interest in not being killed by a wrongdoer, whereas I'm well motivated if I go down the left-hand road. So if anything, I think I should take the left-hand road, but perhaps I should flip a coin. Probably I should flip a coin in this kind of case. I think that rules out a general principle which says, if that's the right view about that case, that rules out a general principle which says intervening agency is always a discounter in proportionality judgments. And then I thought we could have a more tailored principle which draws on the kinds of relationships that are going to exist between people when people aren't allowed to act in certain ways in virtue of the fact that other people have bad attitudes. Sometimes that makes a very significant difference to what you're allowed to do. So for example, I think it's okay to get into an interracial marriage where racists will then riot. In that case, it's something to do with the special way in which the racists are motivated by the interracial marriage that permits me to get into the interracial marriage. And I think your rape example probably has a similar kind of quality when it's described in one kind of way, but perhaps not when it's described in another kind of way. And that's going to make a difference, I think, about whether it's permissible to resist the rape. So we need to know more about the kind of relationship between the wrongdoer and the potential rape victim that's going to arise if she's not permitted to defend herself. Why is it exactly that these two other rapes are going to happen if she resists? And spelling out that, I think, is going to make a difference to whether she acts permissibly in resisting the rape or not. So I think the more tailored principles needed here. I don't have a full account of how this is going to go, but something more circumscribed, I think, is required.
What kind of relationship do you think would make it impermissible for her to resist?
I think, so in the case that I had with the boulder, if her resisting merely creates a new opportunity for a rape that wasn't going to exist otherwise, I think she's not permitted to resist. In that case, I think what she's doing is just like averting a threat away from one towards two, and that's not permitted. Whereas if the reason why the other rapes are going to come about is because of particular hatred from him towards her when she's a resistor, that's going to set up a special relationship of domination between them where his attitudes towards her will be the reason why the further rapes occur. And in that case, I think she's permitted to resist.
So if it was something like the only way that she can prevent the attack is by locking him in this room, but in the room are the two other women, and that's the only way he can get to them, and she's got the key, so she locks him in, something
And she's
like
not
that.
allowed.
And she's not allowed. Okay, that's it. I'll have to think about that. That's interesting. Thanks very much. What else did you say? Oh, then yeah, okay, so yeah, I think you might be right. Well, I don't... let's not go too far. It's not obvious to me that you're wrong.
Yeah, normal.
Yeah, so thanks very much. I'll leave it there for now. Seth, I think you're next.
I just wanted to advance a possible reason for distinguishing between vital and lesser interests, in particular when it comes to other defense rather than individual self-defense. So I'm assuming now that where other defense is concerned, the authorization of the beneficiary is morally significant. Right? So if you attack me and BJ's going to defend me, but I actually want to die, then for BJ to defend me would be impermissible. So I'm just going to assume that.
Yep.
Now, often in situations of other defense, there's no way of knowing whether you're authorized by the person who you're going to defend because it's far too, there's far too kinetic a situation. You don't have the time or the opportunity to know. But if it's their vital interests that are threatened, you can pretty much assume that they authorize you. Right? And I think that's at least a valid heuristic. It might also be something more. So if you're going to kill a bunch of people and I'm going to stop you, I don't necessarily need to stop and ask everybody, look, is it okay, do you really want to live? And only then defend them by killing you. Right? Because it's their vital interests are at stake. But there are some interests that we can't make that sort of assumption about. Right? And I would say that this might be a relevant class of lesser interests. And I think that probably with political goods, that's very much going to be the sort of thing that is very much contested. Right? So if you're going to act on behalf of your whole population in order to preserve these particular political goods, then it seems to me that you can't just assume in the way that you do when you have vital interests at stake. You can't just assume that they consent to you fighting on their behalf. You really need to have some sort of process or institutional process which is going to give you that authority and that authorization. So there, I think, is one significant distinction that one might draw between those two types of interests.
Yes, good, thank you. Okay. I have to think about that, but I mean, even just thinking quickly, I mean, still, I'm not sure how much of an impact that would have at the level of what it's permissible to do in resistance, because we could presumably set up such a system. And then the question would be, once the authorization is given, are you allowed to do stuff? So still, when it gets to the level of the defensive war, it might not make too much difference, but I see what you mean, that it might, it's a possible difference perhaps, but I'm still not clear that it's not obvious to me that we could clearly demarcate which fall into which category. So it could be a difference, but I don't know how much use it's going to give us.
One possible difference that it would make is that it would mean that only certain types of entities get to go to war to defend those sorts of interests, because you have to have a certain set of institutions in place in order to get that sort of authorization. So while it could be the case that any aggregate of people can fight, some subset of that aggregate can fight to defend the other's lives without asking for other authorization, but only certain types of groups of people have the institutions in place to determine whether that authorization exists to protect other types of interests. So this sort of leans towards an account in which there is something significant about national self-defense, something significant about the state's role within it, that it enables the authorization of the defense of these large aggregated sums of lesser goods.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to me a sort of contingent feature that's not the right kind of inherent value of the sort that David's talking about. But it's interesting stuff. Thank you. I'll think on it. Right, who's next? Jeff, you're next.
Well, I wanted to say, first of all, that I was really disappointed in the talk.
Thanks. No picture.
Because there was no picture of me
Yeah.
up there. Yeah. Couple of points about what I think is particularly problematic about the lesser aggression, and why I think some of the responses that we've heard are problematic. First of all, you mentioned one person breaking a large number of people's wrists, not just one person's wrist, but if the number of wrists that a particular person breaks is large enough, then that person can be appropriately killed. The problem about lesser aggression, though, is if it's unresisted, that is, if the conditional threat is not provoked, then the harm to any individual victim that can be attributable to any of the individual lesser aggressors is going to be absolutely tiny, because they're not going to be harming. It's not going to be the case that there's going to be any kind of one-to-one relation between harm caused by an aggressor and harm suffered by a victim. They're going to be making, each individual aggressor is going to be making some very tiny contribution to the lesser harm suffered by each victim. So it's like making a tiny contribution to the breaking of 1 million people's